Welcome back to The Sleep Detective, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of criminal psychology. I'm your host, and tonight we're entering the mind of one of America's most prolific serial killers. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, confessed to murdering 49 women, though investigators believe the actual number could exceed 90 victims. What makes Ridgway unique isn't just his victim count. It's his ability to hide in plain sight for over 2 decades while methodically hunting vulnerable women. This case will reveal how childhood trauma, combined with specific psychological patterns, can create a predator who operates with terrifying efficiency while maintaining the facade of an ordinary family man. Here's your challenge for tonight's deep dive. Based on what you know about serial killer psychology, predict what specific childhood trauma shaped Ridgway's victim selection. Was it maternal abandonment, sexual abuse, or something else entirely? Share your psychological analysis in the comments below. If you're ready to explore the darkest aspects of human psychology every week, subscribe now. We upload comprehensive psychological analyses every 48 hours, and you won't want to miss our upcoming copycat analysis series. Gary Leon Ridgway was born February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. His father was a bus driver who worked long hours to support the family. His mother, Mary Rita Ridgway, was a domineering woman who controlled every aspect of the household with an iron fist. From the earliest age, Gary witnessed his mother's explosive temper and unpredictable mood swings. She would scream at his father for hours, then turn to Gary with sudden affection. This created a psychological pattern of confusion around female authority figures that would define his entire life. The family moved to McMicken Heights, Washington, when Gary was 11 years old. The relocation disrupted his already fragile sense of stability. In his new environment, he struggled to form meaningful connections with peers and became increasingly isolated. Mary Ridgway's treatment of Gary was psychologically complex and damaging. She would bathe him until he was well into his teens, creating inappropriate boundaries that confused his developing sexuality. These sessions became a source of both shame and arousal for the boy. By age 13, Gary had developed a pattern of wetting his bed that continued into his late teens. His mother's response was to humiliate him publicly, washing his sheets and hanging them outside for neighbors to see. This created deep psychological wounds around shame and sexual dysfunction. His academic performance was consistently poor, not due to lack of intelligence, but because of his inability to concentrate. Teachers noted that he would stare out windows for hours, lost in elaborate fantasies that no one else could understand. The fantasies began as simple escapes from his mother's criticism, but gradually, they evolved into more complex scenarios involving control and domination. He would imagine himself as powerful, respected, feared. These mental rehearsals would later become blueprints for his crimes. Gary's relationship with his father was distant and emotionally unavailable. His father worked constantly to avoid being home, leaving Gary alone with his mother's psychological manipulation. This absence of a stable male role model left Gary without tools to understand healthy relationships. At age 16, Gary experienced his first sexual encounter with a neighborhood girl. The experience was brief and unsatisfying, but it triggered something in his psychology. He began to associate sexual contact with power and control rather than intimacy or affection. His mother's reaction to learning about his sexual activity was explosive. She called him dirty, sinful, and worthless. She made him feel that his sexual desires were inherently evil. This created a psychological split between his sexual impulses and his sense of morality. Gary began to develop what psychologists call compartmentalization. He learned to separate different aspects of his personality into isolated mental spaces. In one compartment, he was the obedient son. In another, darker thoughts were growing. His high school years were marked by increasing antisocial behavior. He was caught torturing small animals in the woods behind his house. When confronted, he showed no empathy or remorse. He simply stated that he wanted to see what would happen. The animal cruelty escalated in both frequency and brutality. He would capture cats and dogs, then experiment with different methods of killing them. This behavior represents a classic early warning sign of future violent behavior toward humans. His teachers noticed that Gary would often arrive at school with scratches and bruises on his hands. When asked about these injuries, he would claim they were from yard work or sports. In reality, they were from his increasingly violent encounters with animals. Gary's first job was at a local truck manufacturing plant. The work was physical and repetitive, which suited his psychological needs. He could lose himself in the mechanical tasks while his mind wandered to darker places. His co-workers remember him as quiet and unremarkable. He never caused problems, never stood out, never drew attention to himself. This invisibility was not accidental. It was a carefully cultivated psychological defense mechanism. At age 19, Gary married his high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig. The marriage was his attempt to create a normal life, to suppress the dark impulses that were growing stronger. For a brief period, it seemed to work, but the psychological patterns established in childhood were too deeply ingrained. Gary's need for control began to manifest in his marriage. He became increasingly possessive and jealous, monitoring Claudia's every movement and interaction. The marriage lasted only 2 years. Claudia later described feeling suffocated by Gary's constant surveillance and emotional manipulation. She sensed something darker beneath his quiet exterior, though she couldn't articulate what it was. After the divorce, Gary's psychological defenses began to crumble. The facade of normalcy that marriage had provided was gone. He was alone with his thoughts, his fantasies, and his growing compulsion to act on them. He began frequenting areas where prostitutes worked. Initially, he told himself it was just for sexual gratification, but the psychology behind his choices was more complex. He was drawn to women he perceived as powerless and disposable. His interactions with these women revealed his true psychological state. He was polite, even kind, but there was something calculating in his demeanor. He was studying them, learning their routines, understanding their vulnerabilities. Gary's second marriage to Marcia Winslow in 1973 was another attempt to create stability, but the psychological patterns were repeating. He was drawn to women he could control, while simultaneously resenting that control. The marriage produced a son, Matthew, in 1975. Gary's relationship with his child was complex. He was capable of tenderness and affection, but these emotions seemed disconnected from his darker impulses. The compartmentalization was becoming more sophisticated. His work at the Kenworth truck plant continued to provide psychological cover. His supervisors saw him as a reliable employee who never missed work and never caused problems. This employment stability became crucial to his later criminal activities. By his late 20s, Gary had developed a fully formed psychological profile. He was organized, methodical, and patient. He had learned to suppress his violent impulses when necessary, but they were always present, always growing stronger. His fantasies had evolved from simple power scenarios to detailed plans for abduction and murder. He would drive through areas where prostitutes worked, not yet ready to act, but mentally rehearsing every detail of what he might do. The psychological foundation was complete. Gary Ridgway had developed all the mental tools necessary to become one of America's most prolific serial killers. The only thing missing was the final trigger that would transform fantasy into reality. His childhood trauma, combined with his mother's psychological manipulation and his father's absence, had created a predator. The compartmentalization, the need for control, the dehumanization of women, all the pieces were in place. What happened next would shock the Pacific Northwest and reveal the terrifying efficiency of a mind that had spent decades preparing for murder. The psychological foundation had been laid. Now it was time to build upon it. The boy who wet his bed and tortured animals was about to become the Green River Killer. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic. It was the inevitable result of a psychology that had been carefully, methodically, and tragically constructed over 3 decades of psychological development. By his early 20s, Gary Ridgway had developed a personality structure that would define his entire criminal career. The core of his psychological makeup was built around control, deception, and compartmentalization. These weren't conscious choices, but automatic responses to the trauma he had experienced. His ability to present different versions of himself to different people became almost supernatural. At work, he was the reliable employee who never missed a day. At home, he was the quiet husband. In his private moments, he was something else entirely. This psychological splitting would become his greatest weapon. The religious conversion that Gary experienced in his late 20s was not genuine spiritual awakening, but psychological camouflage. He began attending church regularly, carrying a Bible, and speaking about Christian values. But this was simply another mask, another compartment in his fragmented personality. His co-workers at Kenworth noticed the change and respected him for his apparent devotion. Gary understood that religious identity provided perfect cover for his true nature. Who would suspect a God-fearing man of harboring such dark impulses? The psychology was brilliant in its simplicity. The religious facade also served another psychological function. It allowed Gary to experience genuine moments of feeling good about himself. When he was reading scripture or attending services, he could temporarily forget the darkness that lived inside him. This wasn't redemption, it was psychological pressure release. His relationship with his second wife, Marcia, revealed how sophisticated his deception had become. She later described him as a devoted husband who never raised his voice or showed anger. She had no idea that beneath this calm exterior, violent fantasies were becoming more detailed and more frequent. Gary's psychological profile was crystallizing around specific patterns. He was attracted to women he perceived as morally compromised or socially disposable. Prostitutes represented the perfect victims because society already viewed them as less valuable. This wasn't Gary's opinion alone. It was a reflection of broader social attitudes he could exploit. His interactions with these women revealed the predator beneath the religious mask. He would approach them with apparent kindness, even concern for their welfare. But he was actually studying them, learning their routines, understanding their vulnerabilities. Every conversation was reconnaissance. The psychological mechanism Gary developed for dealing with guilt was remarkably sophisticated. He convinced himself that he was actually helping these women by removing them from lives of sin and degradation. This rationalization allowed him to maintain his religious identity while planning murder. His methodical nature extended to every aspect of his personality. Gary never acted on impulse. Every decision was calculated, every move planned. This wasn't the chaotic psychology of a disorganized killer, but the cold efficiency of a predator who had learned patience through decades of psychological conditioning. The relationship with his son Matthew became another tool for maintaining his normal facade. Gary was capable of genuine affection toward his child, but this emotional capacity seemed completely separate from his predatory impulses. He could be a loving father and a serial killer simultaneously. His psychological compartmentalization was so complete that he could attend church on Sunday morning, then spend Sunday evening driving through areas where prostitutes worked, fantasizing about abduction and murder. These weren't conflicting identities fighting for control. They were separate personalities coexisting. Gary's personality development included an almost supernatural ability to read people's expectations and mirror them perfectly. With religious people, he became devoutly Christian. With coworkers, he became the reliable team player. With victims, he became whatever they needed him to be to trust him. This psychological adaptability made him nearly impossible to profile using traditional methods. He left no consistent behavioral signature in his social interactions. The only constant was his methodical approach to everything he did. But even this was hidden beneath layers of manufactured normalcy. His marriage to his third wife, Judith, in 1988 represented the pinnacle of his psychological mastery. Judith later described him as the most considerate man she had ever known. He brought her flowers, never forgot anniversaries, and treated her with constant kindness, all while actively murdering women. The psychological energy required to maintain these multiple personalities was enormous. Gary developed specific rituals and routines that helped him transition between different aspects of his identity. These weren't conscious psychological tools, but automatic responses his mind had developed to manage the complexity. His relationship with authority figures revealed another aspect of his personality formation. Gary was never confrontational or resistant. He submitted to authority completely, whether it was supervisors at work or police officers during routine traffic stops. This submissiveness was calculated psychological camouflage. The development of his victim selection criteria was psychologically sophisticated. Gary didn't choose women randomly. He identified those who were most vulnerable, least likely to be missed, and most likely to trust a seemingly kind stranger. Every choice was based on psychological assessment of risk and opportunity. His ability to maintain long-term employment at Kenworth for over 30 years while committing dozens of murders required extraordinary psychological discipline. He never allowed his criminal activities to interfere with his work schedule. Murder was something he did in his spare time, like a hobby. The psychological pressure of maintaining his facade occasionally manifested in minor behavioral changes that those closest to him noticed. Judith later recalled that Gary would sometimes stare into space for long periods, lost in thoughts he never shared. These moments were glimpses into the darkness he kept hidden. His religious activities intensified during periods of high criminal activity. When Gary was actively hunting and killing, he would increase his church attendance and Bible study. This wasn't coincidence but psychological necessity. The religious identity provided balance for the criminal identity. Gary's personality included an almost pathological need for routine and predictability. He ate the same foods, took the same routes to work, and followed the same patterns every day. This obsession with routine extended to his criminal activities, making him both efficient and vulnerable to detection. The psychological sophistication of his deception was revealed in how he managed relationships with victims' families. When bodies were discovered, Gary would sometimes attend candlelight vigils or community meetings about the murders. He would express appropriate concern and sympathy while internally reliving his crimes. His personality formation included the development of what psychologists call emotional mimicry. Gary could reproduce appropriate emotional responses without actually feeling them. He could cry at funerals, laugh at jokes, and express concern for others while feeling nothing genuine. The most disturbing aspect of Gary's personality was his ability to genuinely care about some people while simultaneously dehumanizing others. He could love his wife and son while viewing prostitutes as less than human. This selective empathy was psychologically crucial to his criminal success. His relationship with his own sexuality became increasingly complex as his personality solidified. Gary associated sexual contact with power and control rather than intimacy. Even his marriages were psychological experiments in domination rather than genuine partnerships. The final aspect of Gary's personality formation was his development of what can only be described as criminal patience. He could wait months or even years between kills if circumstances required it. This wasn't lack of compulsion but psychological discipline developed through decades of practice. By his 30s, Gary Ridgway had become a psychological predator of extraordinary sophistication. His personality was a carefully constructed weapon designed to hunt human beings while maintaining the appearance of respectability. The religious family man was ready to become the Green River Killer. His personality formation was complete. The psychological tools were in place. The facade was perfected. The next phase would be the emergence of the darkness that had been growing beneath the surface for over 3 decades. The boy who had been shaped by his mother's psychological manipulation had become a man capable of manipulating everyone around him. The transformation was complete. The predator was ready to hunt. The first time Gary Ridgway felt the genuine urge to kill a human being was during his second marriage to Marcia. He was driving home from work when he saw a woman walking alone on a dark street. The thought entered his mind with startling clarity. He could stop the car, force her inside, and no one would ever know. The psychological sensation was unlike anything he had experienced before. It wasn't anger or rage driving the impulse. It was curiosity combined with a deep sense of power. He wanted to know what it would feel like to have complete control over another human being's life and death. Gary pulled over and sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching the woman disappear into the distance. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from excitement. The fantasy had felt so real, so achievable, that he could almost taste it. This was the moment his psychological development crossed a critical threshold. He drove home that night in a state of psychological euphoria. The dark thought had given him a rush more powerful than any drug. For the first time in his life, Gary felt truly alive. The religious facade, the work routine, the marriage, everything else seemed gray and meaningless compared to this electric possibility. The next few weeks were psychologically transformative. Gary found himself driving through areas where women walked alone, not yet ready to act, but mentally rehearsing scenarios. He was studying the logistics of abduction, where to park, how to approach, what to say to gain trust. His religious activities intensified during this period, but now they served a different psychological function. Gary was using scripture study and prayer as a way to suppress the growing compulsion. He genuinely believed he could pray away the dark impulses, but he was fighting a psychological battle he had already lost. The fantasies became more detailed and more frequent. Gary would lie awake at night constructing elaborate scenarios of abduction, control, and murder. These weren't random violent thoughts, but carefully planned psychological rehearsals. His mind was preparing for something his conscious self wasn't ready to acknowledge. His behavior at work began to change in subtle ways. Coworkers noticed that Gary seemed distracted, often staring out windows during breaks. When asked what he was thinking about, He would claim he was planning home improvement projects. In reality, he was visualizing murder scenarios. The psychological pressure of suppressing these impulses began to manifest in physical symptoms. Gary developed chronic headaches and insomnia. His body was responding to the internal conflict between his conscious desire to be good and his unconscious compulsion to kill. His relationship with Marcia became strained as Gary struggled with his psychological transformation. He became more controlling and possessive, treating her as a practice subject for the domination fantasies he was developing. She sensed something changing in him but couldn't identify what it was. Gary's first serious attempt at acting on his impulses came during a business trip to Portland in 1978. He was alone in an unfamiliar city, which provided psychological cover for experimentation. He spent an entire evening driving through areas where prostitutes worked, gathering intelligence and building courage. He approached several women that night, claiming he was looking for directions or asking about services, but Gary was actually testing his ability to get close to potential victims. Each interaction was a psychological experiment in manipulation and control. He was learning how to read their vulnerabilities. The closest he came to acting was with a young woman who got into his car to discuss prices. For 5 minutes, Gary sat with her in his vehicle, knowing he could drive anywhere he wanted. The power was intoxicating, but he wasn't quite ready. He paid her for her time and drove away, already planning his return. That night in his hotel room, Gary experienced what can only be described as psychological breakthrough. The fantasy of killing was no longer abstract. It had faces, voices, and realistic scenarios. He had crossed the line from imagination to planning. The psychological momentum was building toward inevitability. Back home, Gary's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, claiming he was running errands or visiting friends. In reality, he was driving through areas where vulnerable women congregated, refining his approach and building psychological momentum. His religious facade began to crack under the pressure of his impulses. Gary started questioning scripture, looking for justification for what he was contemplating. He convinced himself that removing sinful women from the world might actually be God's work. This rationalization was psychologically crucial for maintaining his self-image. The first time Gary carried a weapon while hunting was a psychological milestone. He placed a knife under his car seat and drove through the SeaTac Strip, knowing he now had the means to act on his impulses. The presence of the weapon transformed the psychological dynamic from fantasy to genuine threat. His victim selection criteria became more sophisticated as his impulses strengthened. Gary identified women who appeared to be drug addicts or runaways, reasoning that they would be less likely to be missed. This wasn't random targeting, but calculated psychological assessment of vulnerability and social invisibility. The breakthrough moment came when Gary realized he could use his religious identity as psychological camouflage for approaching potential victims. He could present himself as someone trying to help them escape their lifestyle. This approach would allow him to get close while maintaining his self-image as a good person. His first successful abduction attempt was with a prostitute named Wendy Lee Caulfield in July 1982. Gary approached her under the pretense of hiring her services, but his real intention was psychological experimentation. He wanted to test whether he could actually follow through on the impulses that had been building for years. The psychological moment when Gary decided to kill Wendy was surprisingly calm. There was no rage, no emotional explosion. It was simply the logical conclusion of a process that had been developing for years. The dark impulse had finally found expression in reality. After the murder, Gary experienced a psychological state that can only be described as completion. The fantasies that had tormented him for years had been realized, but rather than satisfaction, he felt an immediate need to repeat the experience. The first kill had created psychological addiction. His behavior immediately after the murder was revealing. Gary returned home to Marcia and acted completely normal. He helped with dinner, watched television, and went to bed as if nothing had happened. The compartmentalization was so complete that the murder might have occurred in a different psychological universe. The next few days were psychologically critical. Gary waited for feelings of guilt or remorse that never came. Instead, he felt a sense of accomplishment and growing confidence. The psychological barrier between fantasy and reality had been permanently broken. His religious activities reached a fever pitch in the weeks following the first murder. Gary attended church multiple times per week and began leading Bible study groups. But this wasn't spiritual awakening or guilt-driven repentance. It was psychological balancing, maintaining his good identity to offset the evil one. The most disturbing aspect of Gary's psychological state after the first kill was his immediate planning for the second. The murder hadn't satisfied his compulsion but intensified it. The dark impulse had tasted blood and wanted more. The psychological addiction was already forming. Gary began to view his first murder as a successful experiment that needed refinement. He analyzed what had gone well and what could be improved. This clinical approach to killing revealed the true nature of his psychology. Murder wasn't an emotional release, but a technical skill to be perfected. His victim selection became more systematic after proving he could actually kill. Gary developed specific criteria for targeting women who would provide the least risk and maximum opportunity. Every choice was based on psychological assessment and logistical calculation. The psychological transformation was complete. Gary Ridgway was no longer a man fighting dark impulses. He was a predator who had discovered his true nature. The first dark impulse had become the first murder, and the first murder had created an insatiable appetite for more. The religious family man who attended church and loved his wife had successfully integrated a killer identity into his psychological structure. The compartmentalization was perfect. Gary Ridgway was ready to become the Green River Killer. The dark impulses were no longer impulses. They were a fully realized psychological drive that would dominate the next 20 years of his life. The transformation from fantasy to reality was complete, and there would be no turning back. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1980s provided the perfect environmental storm for Gary Ridgway's criminal evolution. The region's rapid economic growth had created a transient population of vulnerable women, many struggling with addiction and homelessness. For a predator learning his craft, this was an ideal hunting ground. The SeaTac Strip became Gary's primary operational theater. This area near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was a magnet for runaway teenagers, drug addicts, and women working in prostitution. The constant flow of people provided both abundant targets and natural cover for his activities. Gary's work schedule at Kenworth provided crucial environmental advantages. His shift ended at 3:30 p.m., giving him hours of daylight to hunt while maintaining the appearance of a normal working man. His coworkers never questioned his whereabouts because he was such a reliable employee during work hours. The geography of King County played directly into Gary's psychological needs. The Green River area offered isolated dumping sites surrounded by dense forests and ravines. These locations satisfied his compulsion to revisit victims while providing practical advantages for body disposal. The environment was conspiring with his psychology. The social attitudes of the 1980s toward prostitution created an environmental trigger that Gary exploited masterfully. Society viewed these women as disposable, which aligned perfectly with his own psychological dehumanization of them. The cultural environment validated his victim selection in ways that made his crimes feel justified. Local law enforcement's limited resources and jurisdictional complications provided environmental cover for Gary's activities. Multiple police departments were involved as bodies appeared across different cities and counties. This bureaucratic fragmentation allowed him to operate while investigators struggled to coordinate their efforts. The economic recession of the early 1980s created more desperate women willing to take risks for money. Gary understood that desperation made women more likely to get into cars with strangers. The economic environment was generating victims faster than he could hunt them. Gary's neighborhood in Des Moines provided perfect psychological camouflage. He lived in a middle-class suburban area where serial killers simply weren't expected to exist. His neighbors saw him as a quiet family man who kept his yard neat and attended church regularly. The suburban environment masked his true nature. The automotive culture of the Pacific Northwest played a crucial role in Gary's criminal methodology. Cars were essential for survival in the sprawling region, and women working the streets regularly got into vehicles with strangers. This cultural norm provided Gary with easy access to victims. The lack of security cameras and electronic surveillance in the 1980s created an environmental advantage that modern killers don't enjoy. Gary could approach women, transport them, and dispose of bodies without leaving digital evidence. The technological environment of the era protected his activities. Gary's access to multiple vehicles through his marriage to Judith provided operational flexibility. He could use different cars for different purposes, reducing the risk of witnesses connecting him to multiple crime scenes. His domestic environment was unknowingly supporting his criminal activities. The religious community that embraced Gary provided crucial environmental cover. His church attendance and Bible study leadership gave him access to alibis and character witnesses. The faith-based environment created a protective shield around his reputation that investigators were reluctant to penetrate. The industrial nature of the Green River area meant that bodies could remain undiscovered for months or years. Gary understood the environmental factors that affected decomposition and discovery. He was using the natural environment as an active partner in concealing his crimes. Gary's familiarity with the region from childhood gave him environmental advantages that outsiders couldn't match. He knew back roads, isolated areas, and seasonal patterns that affected both hunting opportunities and body disposal. His environmental knowledge was encyclopedic and constantly expanding. The drug epidemic ravaging the Pacific Northwest created a steady supply of women whose disappearances might not be immediately reported. Gary recognized that addiction created psychological and social isolation that made women particularly vulnerable to his predatory approach. The trucking industry environment where Gary worked provided unexpected advantages. Truck stops and industrial areas were places where commercial sex work occurred, giving him legitimate reasons to be present in areas where he could hunt. His work environment camouflaged his criminal environment. Seasonal changes in the Pacific Northwest affected Gary's hunting patterns in ways that revealed his environmental sophistication. He understood that winter weather would slow body discovery and that summer heat would accelerate decomposition. He adapted his methods to environmental conditions. The cultural environment of the 1980s provided Gary with victim selection advantages that wouldn't exist today. Missing person investigations were less sophisticated. Media coverage was limited, and social services for vulnerable women were inadequate. The cultural environment was practically designed for his success. Gary's access to rural areas through hunting and fishing activities provided cover for reconnaissance missions. He could explore potential dump sites while appearing to engage in normal recreational activities. His legitimate outdoor interests camouflaged his criminal site selection. The highway system connecting Seattle to Tacoma created a transportation corridor that Gary exploited brilliantly. He could pick up victims in one jurisdiction, kill them in another, and dispose of bodies in a third. The road network facilitated his criminal mobility while complicating investigations. Environmental factors even influenced Gary's victim interaction strategies. He understood that certain weather conditions, times of day, and seasonal patterns affected women's desperation levels and willingness to take risks. He used environmental psychology to optimize his hunting success. The lack of centralized databases and interagency communication created information gaps that Gary instinctively exploited. He understood that environmental fragmentation in law enforcement would work to his advantage. His crimes were falling into the cracks between jurisdictions. Gary's home environment with Judith provided the perfect psychological anchor for his criminal activities. He could return from hunting and killing to a loving wife who never suspected his true nature. This domestic stability was environmentally crucial to maintaining his facade. The social environment of the Pacific Northwest, with its emphasis on privacy and minding one's own business, protected Gary from scrutiny. Neighbors didn't ask too many questions, and coworkers respected personal boundaries. The cultural environment valued exactly the kind of privacy that his crimes required. Environmental factors even affected Gary's post-murder rituals. He would return to dump sites during different seasons to observe how environmental conditions were affecting the bodies. These revisits weren't just psychological compulsion but environmental research to improve his methods. The changing demographics of the region worked in Gary's favor as the population grew and became more transient. New residents didn't know the area well enough to notice patterns, and established residents assumed problems were caused by newcomers. The environmental chaos provided perfect cover. Gary's understanding of environmental forensics was remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal training. He knew that certain soil conditions, water exposure, and wildlife activity would affect evidence preservation. He was using environmental science to perfect his crimes. The economic boom in the tech industry was changing the social landscape in ways that benefited Gary's activities. Increased wealth created greater social stratification, making it easier for problems affecting poor women to be ignored by the broader community. Environmental factors influenced even Gary's weapon selection and disposal methods. He understood that certain materials would degrade in Pacific Northwest conditions while others would persist. His environmental knowledge extended to every aspect of his criminal methodology. The transformation of the Pacific Northwest from a logging and fishing economy to a more diverse industrial base created social disruption that Gary exploited. Traditional community structures were breaking down, creating more vulnerable women and fewer social safety nets. Gary had turned the entire Pacific Northwest environment into his personal hunting preserve. Every geographic, social, cultural, and economic factor was being analyzed and exploited. The environment wasn't just enabling his crimes, it was actively facilitating them. Gary Ridgway approached murder with the same methodical precision he brought to his work at the truck factory. After his first kill, he immediately began analyzing what had worked and what needed improvement. This wasn't emotional processing, but technical evaluation. He was treating murder as a skill to be perfected through practice and refinement. His victim approach strategy evolved through careful experimentation. Gary discovered that presenting himself as a potential customer was more effective than appearing as a good Samaritan. Women were more likely to trust a John than a stranger offering help. This psychological insight became the foundation of his hunting methodology. The development of his killing technique revealed Gary's analytical mind. He experimented with different methods of strangulation, studying which approaches were most efficient and left the least evidence. He wasn't driven by sadistic pleasure, but by operational effectiveness. Murder was becoming a technical procedure. Gary's vehicle selection became increasingly sophisticated as his methodology developed. He learned that certain car models attracted less attention than others. He preferred vehicles that were common enough to blend in, but reliable enough to transport struggling victims. Every choice was calculated for maximum operational advantage. His timing strategies evolved through trial and error. Gary discovered that approaching women during shift changes provided optimal cover. Late afternoon offered enough light for target selection but sufficient darkness for concealment. He was developing a science of predatory timing. The psychological manipulation techniques Gary perfected were remarkably sophisticated. He learned to mirror the speech patterns and emotional states of his targets. With desperate women, he appeared sympathetic. With confident women, he projected reliability. His methodology included becoming whatever his victims needed him to be. Gary's site selection for encounters demonstrated his growing expertise in risk management. He identified locations that provided privacy for the attack while offering multiple escape routes if interrupted. Every killing ground was chosen after careful reconnaissance and strategic analysis. His restraint methods evolved from crude improvisation to calculated efficiency. Gary experimented with different materials and techniques for controlling victims. He studied what worked best for different body types and resistance levels. Even his tools of control were systematically optimized. The development of Gary's disposal methodology revealed his understanding of forensic science. He learned which locations provided optimal concealment while allowing for easy access during revisits. He was creating a network of disposal sites based on scientific principles of decomposition and discovery probability. Gary's clothing and appearance management became part of his operational security. He developed specific outfits for hunting that could be easily cleaned or disposed of. His methodology included detailed protocols for evidence elimination that extended to every aspect of his presentation. His communication strategies with victims were psychologically sophisticated. Gary learned to read desperation levels and adjust his approach accordingly. He developed different personas for different types of women, each calibrated to maximize trust and minimize resistance. His methodology included advanced psychological manipulation. The timing of Gary's kills within each encounter was carefully calculated. He learned to identify the moment when victims were most vulnerable and least likely to escape or raise alarm. This timing sense became so refined that he could predict optimal striking moments with frightening accuracy. Gary's evidence elimination protocols became increasingly comprehensive. He developed systematic approaches to cleaning vehicles, disposing of clothing, and managing physical traces. His methodology included detailed checklists that he followed after every kill to ensure nothing was overlooked. His body positioning and staging techniques evolved through experimentation. Gary discovered that certain arrangements made bodies less likely to be discovered quickly, while others sent specific messages to investigators. He was using corpse placement as a form of psychological warfare. The development of Gary's trophy collection methodology revealed his need for psychological connection to his crimes. He began taking specific items from victims that could be kept without creating evidence trails. These mementos served both as psychological reinforcement and operational intelligence for future kills. Gary's reconnaissance techniques became increasingly sophisticated as his methodology matured. He developed systematic approaches to studying potential victims. Before approach, he would observe women for hours or days, learning their routines and identifying optimal intervention points. His risk assessment capabilities evolved through careful analysis of close calls and near discoveries. Gary learned to read environmental cues that indicated increased danger. His methodology included detailed protocols for aborting operations when risk levels exceeded acceptable thresholds. The psychological conditioning techniques Gary developed for himself were remarkably advanced. He created mental rehearsal protocols that allowed him to practice killing scenarios without leaving evidence. His methodology included systematic desensitization to violence and guilt. Gary's victim transportation methods became increasingly refined. He learned optimal routes that minimized exposure while providing contingency options. He developed techniques for managing conscious victims during transport that balanced control with operational security. His killing environment preparation evolved into detailed operational protocols. Gary would modify locations in advance to optimize them for his purposes. He was creating custom murder scenes designed for maximum efficiency and minimum evidence production. The development of Gary's scheduling methodology revealed his integration of criminal activity with normal life. He learned to coordinate hunting trips with work schedules, family obligations, and social activities. Murder became seamlessly integrated into his daily routine. Gary's weapon selection and management became increasingly sophisticated. He developed criteria for choosing tools based on effectiveness, evidence, potential, and disposal requirements. His methodology included detailed protocols for weapon acquisition, maintenance, and elimination. His psychological manipulation of investigators was perhaps his most sophisticated methodology development. Gary learned to present himself as helpful and concerned while subtly misdirecting suspicion. He was manipulating the investigation itself as part of his operational security. The refinement of Gary's victim selection criteria became increasingly precise. He developed detailed profiles of ideal targets based on vulnerability, availability, and risk factors. His methodology included systematic evaluation processes that eliminated unsuitable candidates before approach. Gary's post-murder routine became as methodical as the killings themselves. He developed specific protocols for returning to normal life that included alibi preparation, evidence disposal, and psychological compartmentalization. The methodology extended far beyond the actual murders. His learning and adaptation processes were remarkably systematic. Gary would analyze news reports and police statements to understand investigative progress. He was using law enforcement information to continuously refine his methodology and stay ahead of detection efforts. The development of Gary's emotional regulation techniques allowed him to maintain his facade while actively killing. He learned to suppress guilt, manage excitement, and project normalcy on demand. His methodology included advanced psychological self-management. Gary's operational security protocols became increasingly comprehensive as his experience grew. He developed systematic approaches to surveillance, detection, communication, security, and evidence elimination. His methodology was evolving into a complete criminal operations manual. The integration of technology into Gary's methodology was limited by the era, but still sophisticated. He learned to use payphones for misdirection, exploit limitations of police radio systems, and take advantage of surveillance gaps. He was constantly adapting to technological constraints. Gary's victim interaction protocols became psychologically complex as his methodology matured. He learned to manage victim psychology during the killing process itself, controlling fear and resistance through calculated psychological manipulation. Even murder became a technical procedure requiring specific skills. By the mid-1980s, Gary Ridgway had developed one of the most sophisticated killing methodologies in criminal history. Every aspect of his process had been analyzed, tested, and refined. He had transformed from an impulsive killer into a methodical predator whose techniques would serve him for decades. Chat Control's Sonnet 4. Gary Ridgway's victim selection process was a masterclass in psychological predation. He didn't choose women randomly or based on physical attraction. Every selection was the result of calculated psychological assessment designed to identify the most vulnerable targets with the lowest risk of detection. His approach was clinical, methodical, and terrifyingly effective. The primary psychological profile Gary sought was desperation combined with social isolation. He understood that desperate women would take risks that cautious women wouldn't. More importantly, he recognized that socially isolated women were less likely to be missed quickly. His victim psychology was based on mathematical probability of survival. Gary's understanding of addiction psychology gave him crucial advantages in victim selection. He could identify drug-addicted women by subtle physical and behavioral cues that others might miss. Addicted women represented perfect targets because their need for drugs made them willing to trust strangers, and their lifestyle created natural explanations for disappearance. His psychological assessment of victim age was remarkably sophisticated. Gary preferred women in their late teens to early 20s because they combined physical vulnerability with psychological naivety. Older women had survival instincts honed by experience. Younger women were more likely to trust his carefully crafted personas. The socioeconomic psychology of Gary's victims revealed his understanding of social invisibility. He targeted women from backgrounds where disappearances might be attributed to lifestyle choices rather than foul play. Poor women, addicted women, and women involved in prostitution occupied a social blind spot that Gary exploited ruthlessly. Gary's analysis of victim-family dynamics was psychologically astute. He preferred women who were estranged from families or had histories of running away. He understood that women with strong family connections would be searched for aggressively, while isolated women might disappear without triggering intensive investigations. His understanding of victim transportation psychology was remarkably advanced. Gary could assess within minutes whether a woman would willingly get into his vehicle. He learned to read body language, verbal cues, and environmental factors that indicated a woman's willingness to trust a stranger with transportation. The psychological manipulation Gary employed during victim selection was sophisticated beyond his apparent education level. He could instantly adapt his personality to match what each woman needed to see. With religious women, he became devoutly Christian. With rebellious women, he became understanding and non-judgmental. Gary's assessment of victim resistance potential was based on detailed psychological observation. He could evaluate a woman's likely response to attack based on her posture, speech patterns, and general demeanor. Women who projected confidence or alertness were generally avoided in favor of those who appeared defeated or distracted. His understanding of victim routine psychology allowed him to predict behavior patterns with frightening accuracy. Gary would observe women long enough to understand their schedules, preferences and decision-making patterns. This intelligence gathering made him appear almost psychic in his ability to be in the right place at the right time. The geographic psychology of Gary's victim selection revealed his understanding of territorial behavior. He learned that women working specific areas had psychological attachments to those locations. By appearing regularly in their territories, he became a familiar presence that seemed less threatening than random strangers. Gary's analysis of victim communication patterns was psychologically sophisticated. He could determine within moments whether a woman was likely to tell others about their interaction. Women who were secretive about their activities were preferred because disappearing from an undisclosed location created fewer leads for investigators. His assessment of victim mental health was remarkably accurate for someone without formal training. Gary could identify women suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions that made them more vulnerable to manipulation. Mental illness created psychological leverage that he exploited without hesitation. The seasonal psychology of Gary's victim selection showed his understanding of environmental factors affecting human behavior. He recognized that cold weather made women more likely to accept rides, while economic stress during holidays increased desperation levels. His hunting schedule aligned with psychological vulnerability cycles. Gary's evaluation of victim intelligence was based on rapid psychological assessment during initial contact. He preferred women who weren't too street smart but weren't completely naive either. The ideal victim had enough intelligence to follow instructions, but not enough experience to recognize danger signs. His understanding of victim trauma psychology was disturbingly advanced. Gary could identify women who had histories of abuse or assault. Because trauma often creates specific behavioral patterns, traumatized women were preferred because they were psychologically conditioned to submit to authority and less likely to fight back effectively. The cultural psychology of Gary's victim selection revealed his understanding of social prejudices. He recognized that society's attitudes toward prostitutes, drug addicts, and runaways created an environment where their deaths would receive less investigation and media attention. He was weaponizing social bias. Gary's assessment of victim support systems was remarkably thorough. He would engage women in conversation designed to reveal their social connections. Women who mentioned boyfriends, roommates, or regular contacts were generally avoided in favor of those who appeared to be operating in social isolation. His analysis of victim financial desperation was psychologically sophisticated. Gary could assess debt levels, drug costs, and survival needs within minutes of conversation. Women facing immediate financial crises were more likely to take risks, making them ideal targets for his carefully planned approaches. The psychological timing of Gary's victim approaches was calculated to exploit peak vulnerability moments. He learned to identify when women were most desperate, most tired, or most emotionally compromised. These moments of psychological weakness became his optimal striking opportunities. Gary's understanding of victim fear psychology allowed him to calibrate his approach for maximum effectiveness. He could project enough danger to establish dominance while maintaining enough apparent safety to prevent immediate flight. This psychological balancing act required extraordinary social intelligence. His evaluation of victim escape psychology was based on detailed observation of physical and mental capabilities. Gary could assess running speed, fighting ability, and psychological resilience within minutes. Women who appeared capable of effective resistance were generally avoided for easier targets. The developmental psychology of Gary's younger victims revealed his understanding of adolescent vulnerabilities. Teenage women were often dealing with identity issues, family conflicts, and social pressures that made them more susceptible to adult manipulation. Gary exploited developmental psychology ruthlessly. Gary's analysis of victims' substance abuse patterns allowed him to predict behavior with frightening accuracy. He understood withdrawal cycles, intoxication effects, and drug-seeking behaviors well enough to time his approaches for maximum psychological advantage. Addiction became his weapon. His assessment of victim relationship psychology was remarkably detailed. Gary could determine within minutes whether a woman was in an abusive relationship, recently heartbroken, or emotionally isolated. Emotional vulnerability created psychological opportunities that he exploited without conscience. The occupational psychology of Gary's victims revealed his understanding of sex work dynamics. He learned the economic pressures, safety concerns, and psychological coping mechanisms that define the industry. This knowledge allowed him to blend seamlessly into the client population while selecting optimal targets. Gary's evaluation of victim communication skills helped him identify women who might be able to effectively describe him to others. Women with poor verbal skills or memory problems were preferred because they were less likely to provide useful information to investigators if they survived initial contact. His understanding of victim survival psychology was perhaps most disturbing. Gary could identify women who had given up hope, who were psychologically defeated by life circumstances. These women were least likely to fight for their lives because they had already stopped fighting for their futures. The psychological sophistication of Gary's victim selection process was remarkable for someone who appeared to be a simple factory worker. He had developed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed him to identify the most vulnerable members of society with scientific precision. Gary Ridgway wasn't just selecting victims randomly from a vulnerable population. He was conducting psychological evaluations more sophisticated than many trained professionals could manage. His understanding of human psychology had been weaponized into a system for identifying the perfect targets for murder. Chat Control's Sonnet 4. From 1982 to 1984, Gary Ridgway achieved what criminal psychologists consider the theoretical peak of serial killer efficiency. During this 2-year window, he was operating at maximum psychological capacity, killing at rates that defied conventional understanding of human psychology. His mental state had evolved into something that transcended normal predatory behavior. The psychological architecture Gary had constructed over decades reached perfect operational status during this period. He could transition between his killer identity and family man persona with the fluidity of changing clothes. The compartmentalization wasn't just functional, it was seamless and automatic. His confidence during this phase approached psychological invincibility. Gary began taking calculated risks that would have terrified his earlier self. He operated in broader daylight, approached women in more populated areas, and maintained longer victim interactions. Success had created a feedback loop of increasing boldness. The mental state Gary achieved can only be described as predatory transcendence. Like a master craftsman at peak skill, killing had become an art form requiring no conscious effort. Every movement flowed naturally. Every decision emerged from deep psychological programming that operated below awareness. Gary's physiological responses during this period revealed remarkable psychological control. His stress hormones remained normal, his sleep patterns undisturbed, his appetite healthy. The murders weren't creating psychological burden, but providing psychological nourishment. He was feeding off the killing in ways that enhanced his overall mental health. His relationship with victims evolved into something clinically fascinating during this peak phase. Women weren't human beings to Gary. but complex puzzles requiring specific solutions. The psychological dehumanization was so complete that empathy had been surgically removed from his emotional repertoire. The cognitive load Gary managed during this period was extraordinary. He maintained detailed mental databases of victim information, disposal locations, investigative progress, and operational security, while appearing completely normal in all social contexts. His brain was operating like a criminal supercomputer. Unlike other serial killers who eventually buckle under psychological pressure, Gary seemed to gain strength from each successful murder. Where others experienced escalating tension, Gary found increasing calm. His psychology was operating in reverse of normal criminal patterns. Gary's professional performance reached new heights during his most active killing periods. Supervisors noted improved punctuality, enhanced attention to detail, and remarkable job satisfaction. The murders were energizing his legitimate life rather than compromising it. His family relationships became more intimate and engaging during peak killing activity. Gary displayed increased emotional availability, greater domestic involvement, and enhanced romantic attention toward his wife. The psychological energy from murder was being channeled into strengthening his normal facade. The speed of Gary's decision-making during victim encounters had evolved beyond human norms. He could assess threat levels, evaluate opportunity windows, and execute killing sequences in timeframes that suggested supernatural reflexes. Murder had become muscle memory operating at subconscious levels. His victim manipulation skills reached their zenith during this period. Gary could read desperation indicators, calculate vulnerability coefficients, and calibrate psychological approaches with scientific precision. Every interaction was a masterclass in human exploitation conducted at doctoral levels. Gary's environmental awareness during this phase was almost superhuman. He could process dozens of risk variables simultaneously while maintaining perfect emotional control. Situations that would paralyze normal people with fear became routine operational challenges requiring standard solutions. The emotional performance Gary delivered during this period was Academy Award caliber. He could generate tears at church services while planning strangulation techniques. He could express genuine concern for community safety while actively creating the danger. The psychological acting was flawless. His operational psychology had achieved perfect functional psychopathy. Every emotional response was calculated. Every social interaction was strategic. Every behavioral choice was optimized for maximum camouflage while maintaining peak predatory efficiency. He had become a human killing machine disguised as a model citizen. Gary's trophy collection became psychologically sophisticated during this peak period. He developed systematic approaches to memento selection that provided emotional connection to crimes without creating evidence trails. The souvenirs became psychological fuel feeding his predatory momentum. His relationship with law enforcement evolved into psychological gamesmanship during this phase. Gary attended community meetings about his crimes, engaged officers in casual conversation, and drove past active crime scenes. He was deriving entertainment from proximity to his own investigation. The criminal intelligence Gary developed allowed him to think like a profiler while operating as a killer. He could predict investigative responses, anticipate police strategies, and modify his methodology to stay ahead of law enforcement advances. He was playing chess while they were playing checkers. Gary's killing schedule during this period accelerated rather than satisfied his psychological needs. Each successful murder made the next one easier rather than providing release. His psychology was building momentum like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering speed and mass with each revolution. His emotional relationship with murder had become as mundane as household chores. Gary felt no more psychological connection to killing women than most people feel toward washing dishes. The normalization of extreme violence was psychologically complete and terrifying. The religious activities Gary maintained during peak killing served psychological maintenance functions. Church attendance and Bible study weren't spiritual pursuits, but mental health exercises designed to keep his good identity strong enough to balance his predatory identity. His ability to compartmentalize memory reached extraordinary levels during this period. Gary could store detailed crime scene information in mental vaults that never contaminated his social interactions. He was operating multiple psychological filing systems simultaneously without any cognitive interference. The psychological pressure release Gary achieved through murder was remarkably efficient. Unlike other killers who accumulate stress, Gary was using violence as a psychological maintenance system that kept his mental equilibrium perfectly balanced. Murder was his meditation. Gary's understanding of human psychology became so advanced that he could predict victim behavior with frightening accuracy. He knew exactly when women would resist, when they would comply, and when they would surrender. This knowledge made him infinitely more dangerous. His social integration during this period was flawless. Despite active serial killing, Gary could attend neighborhood barbecues, participate in community events, and maintain workplace friendships with complete authenticity. His different psychological states never contaminated each other. The geographical sophistication of Gary's operations reached peak efficiency during this phase. He could coordinate multiple disposal sites, manage transportation logistics, and optimize body positioning for maximum concealment while maintaining normal work and family schedules. Gary's psychological adaptation to media coverage revealed his growing confidence and entertainment value. Rather than creating caution, publicity fed his ego and motivated increasingly bold operations. He was psychologically feeding off community fear like a vampire feeds off blood. The victim interaction protocols Gary developed allowed him to maintain complete emotional control while his targets experienced maximum terror. He could remain calm and methodical while watching women realize they were going to die. The psychological detachment was absolute. His operational security reached professional levels during this peak period. Gary could eliminate physical evidence, manage witness exposure, and control information flow with the efficiency of a trained intelligence operative. Every aspect of his methodology was optimized for maximum stealth. By 1984, Gary Ridgway had achieved a psychological state that represented the absolute peak of human predatory evolution. He was killing without guilt, planning without stress, and living without internal conflict. His peak psychological state created one of history's most efficient and dangerous human predators. Gary Ridgway's ability to maintain his double life for over 2 decades required sophisticated psychological control mechanisms that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. His system of internal controls was so advanced that he could seamlessly transition between his killer identity and his family man persona without any visible psychological strain or behavioral inconsistencies. The foundation of Gary's control system was what psychologists call cognitive compartmentalization. He had developed the ability to store different aspects of his identity in completely separate mental spaces that never interacted. His work, identity, family identity, religious identity, and killer identity existed independently without creating psychological conflict. His emotional regulation mechanisms were remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal psychological training. Gary could suppress guilt, manage excitement, control anger, and project appropriate emotions on demand. His emotional responses weren't natural reactions, but calculated performances designed to maintain his various social roles. The temporal control mechanisms Gary developed allowed him to maintain strict boundaries between his different activities. He never allowed killing activities to interfere with work schedules or family obligations. Murder was compartmentalized into specific time slots that didn't conflict with his legitimate responsibilities. Gary's memory management system was psychologically complex and highly functional. He could maintain detailed recall of crime scenes while appearing to have normal memory function in social situations. His ability to access or suppress specific memories on demand was crucial to maintaining his facade. His behavioral control mechanisms ensured that stress from his criminal activities never manifested in his legitimate relationships. Gary developed specific rituals and mental exercises that allowed him to transition between identities without carrying psychological residue from one role into another. The linguistic control mechanisms Gary employed were remarkably sophisticated. He developed different vocabularies, speech patterns, and communication styles for different contexts. His language adapted automatically to his current role, creating distinct verbal personalities that supported his psychological compartmentalization. Gary's physical control mechanisms extended to body language, facial expressions, and even posture. He could project different physical personas that matched his psychological identities. The family man carried himself differently than the predator, and the transitions were seamless and automatic. His social control mechanisms allowed him to manage relationships across multiple communities without creating conflicts or suspicions. Gary maintained separate social circles for work, family, church, and criminal activities, ensuring that these groups never intersected in ways that might expose inconsistencies. The financial control mechanisms Gary developed ensured that his criminal activities never created economic irregularities that might attract attention. He carefully managed expenses related to hunting, disposal, materials, and vehicle maintenance to avoid creating suspicious patterns in his spending. Gary's information control mechanisms were crucial to his operational security. He developed systematic approaches to monitoring news coverage, police statements, and community discussions about his crimes while never appearing to have more than casual interest in the investigation. His psychological stress management system was remarkably effective at preventing the accumulation of pressure that destroys most serial killers. Gary developed specific mental exercises and behavioral routines that release psychological tension without compromising his operational security or social facade. The geographical control mechanisms Gary employed ensured that his legitimate activities and criminal activities never created overlapping patterns that investigators might recognize. He maintained strict separation between hunting territories and his normal life locations. Gary's technological control mechanisms were sophisticated despite the limited technology of his era. He understood telephone systems, police communications, and surveillance limitations well enough to exploit them systematically while avoiding detection. His documentation control mechanisms ensured that no physical evidence of his criminal planning or activities existed in areas where it might be discovered. Gary maintained perfect operational security by never creating written records or physical traces of his criminal activities. The psychological trigger management Gary developed allowed him to control his violent impulses when circumstances weren't optimal for acting on them. He could suppress his compulsions for weeks or months when necessary, then release them in controlled bursts when conditions were favorable. Gary's relationship control mechanisms enabled him to maintain intimate connections with multiple people while hiding his true nature from all of them. He developed different emotional personalities that could satisfy the psychological needs of wives, coworkers, and friends without revealing his criminal identity. His routine control mechanisms integrated criminal activities seamlessly into his daily schedule. Murder became just another item on his mental calendar, managed with the same efficiency. He brought to work obligations and family responsibilities. The crisis control mechanisms Gary developed allowed him to manage unexpected complications without psychological breakdown. When police questioned him, when bodies were discovered, or when investigations intensified, he maintained perfect emotional equilibrium through sophisticated psychological management techniques. Gary's identity control mechanisms ensured that his various personas never bled into each other during social interactions. He could attend church services hours after disposing of a body while maintaining complete authenticity in his religious role. His environmental control mechanisms allowed him to modify his behavior based on changing circumstances while maintaining operational consistency. Gary adapted to increase police presence, media attention, and community awareness without altering his fundamental methodology. The communication control mechanisms Gary employed ensured that he never revealed information that might connect him to his crimes during casual conversations. He developed sophisticated filtering systems that prevented accidental disclosures while maintaining natural social interaction. Gary's emotional control mechanisms were so advanced that he could generate genuine seeming grief when discussing victims during community meetings. His ability to produce appropriate emotional responses while feeling nothing authentic was psychologically remarkable. His scheduling control mechanisms allowed him to coordinate complex criminal activities with legitimate obligations without creating conflicts or inconsistencies. Gary's mental calendar management was more sophisticated than most business executives achieve. The psychological maintenance mechanisms Gary developed ensured that his compartmentalization didn't degrade over time. He created specific mental exercises and behavioral routines that reinforced the boundaries between his different identities. Gary's attention control mechanisms allowed him to focus completely on whatever role he was playing while suppressing awareness of his other identities. His psychological presence was total and authentic regardless of which persona he was inhabiting. His impulse control mechanisms were sophisticated enough to allow him to suppress violent urges during inappropriate situations while maintaining the ability to act on them when circumstances were optimal. This psychological flexibility was crucial to his long-term success. The social feedback control mechanisms Gary developed allowed him to monitor how others perceived him and adjust his performance accordingly. He was constantly calibrating his behavior based on social responses to maintain optimal camouflage. Gary's psychological momentum control mechanisms ensured that success in one area didn't create overconfidence that might compromise other areas. He maintained consistent caution across all his activities. Despite his extraordinary success at avoiding detection, his evidence control mechanisms extended beyond physical traces to include behavioral evidence. Gary ensured that his actions never created patterns that might reveal his true nature to observant family members or coworkers. The psychological pressure release mechanisms Gary developed prevented the accumulation of stress that might compromise his control systems. He created specific outlets for tension that didn't conflict with his operational security or social facade. Chat controls Sonnet 4. By the mid-1980s, Gary Ridgway's psychological relationship with killing began to evolve in ways that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The escalation wasn't driven by increasing bloodlust or loss of control, but by a growing psychological addiction to the power and efficiency he had achieved. His success had created an insatiable appetite for more sophisticated challenges. The formation of the Green River Task Force in 1984 created the first significant external pressure Gary had faced since beginning his killing career. Rather than retreating or becoming more cautious, his psychological response was to view the increased law enforcement attention as a personal challenge that validated his importance and skill. Gary's psychological escalation manifested in increasingly bold victim selection. He began targeting women in areas with higher police presence, during daylight hours, and in situations where witness observation was more likely. This wasn't reckless behavior, but calculated risk-taking driven by his need for greater psychological stimulation. The media attention surrounding his crimes created a feedback loop that intensified Gary's psychological investment in his criminal identity. Seeing his work discussed on television and in newspapers provided validation that fed his ego and encouraged him to take greater risks to maintain public attention. His killing frequency during peak periods reached levels that created logistical challenges that hadn't existed during his earlier, more methodical phase. Gary was sometimes killing multiple women per week, creating body disposal problems that forced him to develop new techniques and take greater risks. The psychological pressure of maintaining his religious facade while escalating his criminal activities created internal stress that manifested in subtle behavioral changes. Family members later recalled that Gary became more intense in his religious observance during periods of high killing activity, as if trying to balance the psychological scales. Gary's relationship with his crime scenes began to evolve in ways that increased his exposure to detection. He started returning to disposal sites more frequently, sometimes bringing new victims to locations where bodies were already decomposing. This clustering behavior created geographical patterns that investigators could eventually recognize. The psychological satisfaction Gary derived from manipulating the investigation itself became a source of escalation. He began leaving bodies in locations calculated to send messages to law enforcement, positioning them in ways that demonstrated his control over the investigation's progress. His trophy collection expanded during this period in ways that increased his risk exposure. Gary began taking more items from victims and keeping them in locations where they might be discovered. The psychological need for mementos was beginning to override his operational security instincts. The development of DNA technology in the late 1980s created a new category of pressure that Gary couldn't fully understand or control. While he adapted his evidence elimination techniques, the psychological stress of facing an unknown investigative capability began to affect his decision-making processes. Gary's psychological relationship with potential witnesses evolved during this escalation period. Instead of avoiding situations where he might be observed, he began to relish the challenge of operating under scrutiny. He was deriving psychological satisfaction from the knowledge that people saw him but didn't recognize the danger. The increasing sophistication of the police investigation created psychological pressure that manifested in Gary's need to prove his superiority over law enforcement. He began taking calculated risks designed to demonstrate that he could continue operating despite their best efforts to stop him. His victim interaction psychology became more complex during this period as he began to derive satisfaction from the psychological manipulation itself rather than just the killing. Gary started prolonging victim encounters, extending the period of control and terror before ending their lives. The psychological pressure of maintaining multiple identities began to show strain during this escalation phase. Gary's compartmentalization remained functional, but the energy required to manage increasingly complex criminal activities while maintaining his facade was beginning to tax his psychological resources. His risk assessment capabilities, while still sophisticated, began to be compromised by overconfidence born from years of successful operation. Gary started making decisions based on past success rather than current conditions, creating vulnerabilities that hadn't existed during his more cautious earlier period. The psychological momentum of his killing career created pressure for increasingly dramatic crimes. Gary began experimenting with different killing methods and body positioning techniques that served no operational purpose but satisfied his need for novelty and psychological stimulation. His relationship with his disposal sites became psychologically complex during this period. Gary began treating these locations as personal territory that he needed to monitor and control. This territorial behavior increased his exposure while providing psychological satisfaction. The pressure created by investigative progress forced Gary to adapt his methodology in ways that revealed behavioral patterns. His responses to police pressure created consistency in his inconsistency, providing investigators with psychological profiles they could use to predict his behavior. Gary's psychological relationship with time began to change during this escalation period. The methodical patience that had characterized his earlier kills gave way to a sense of urgency driven by the knowledge that his operational window might be closing. His communication with potential victims became more psychologically sophisticated, but also more distinctive. Gary began developing signature approaches and manipulation techniques that provided psychological satisfaction but created behavioral evidence that investigators could recognize. The psychological pressure of increased media coverage created a feedback loop that drove Gary to more spectacular crimes. He began choosing victims and disposal locations calculated to generate maximum media attention, feeding his psychological need for recognition and validation. His relationship with law enforcement became psychologically complex during this period. Gary began to view individual investigators as personal adversaries rather than professional obstacles, creating emotional investment that compromised his operational detachment. The psychological escalation of Gary's criminal activities began to affect his legitimate relationships in subtle ways. Family members and coworkers noticed increased intensity in his personality, though they couldn't identify the source or significance of these changes. His evidence elimination procedures, while still sophisticated, began to show signs of psychological fatigue. Gary started making small mistakes that reflected the cumulative stress of maintaining perfect operational security for nearly a decade. The psychological pressure of his success created expectations that drove increasingly risky behavior. Gary felt compelled to maintain his reputation as an uncatchable killer, leading him to take chances that his earlier, more cautious self would have avoided. His victim selection criteria began to expand during this period as his psychological needs evolved. Gary started targeting women who didn't fit his traditional profile, driven by his need for variety and challenge rather than operational optimization. The psychological relationship Gary had developed with his crimes began to require increasingly frequent satisfaction. The intervals between kills shortened as his psychological tolerance for normal life decreased, creating operational pressure that increased his exposure to detection. His geographical expansion during this period reflected psychological needs rather than operational requirements. Gary began hunting in new areas not because they offered better opportunities, but because familiar territories no longer provided sufficient psychological stimulation. The pressure created by advancing forensic science forced Gary to modify his techniques in ways that created new behavioral signatures. His adaptations to technological progress revealed psychological patterns that investigators could eventually recognize and exploit. Gary's psychological investment in his criminal identity began to override his survival instincts during this escalation period. The killer persona was becoming more psychologically important than self-preservation, creating vulnerabilities that would eventually lead to his capture. The cumulative psychological pressure of maintaining his double life for over a decade was beginning to create stress fractures in his control mechanisms. While still functional, Gary's psychological systems were showing signs of wear that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. Chat controls Sonnet 4. Gary Ridgway's psychological relationship with the investigation into his crimes was perhaps the most complex aspect of his entire criminal career. Rather than viewing law enforcement as a threat to be avoided, Gary developed a sophisticated psychological framework that treated the investigation as a personal chess match where his intellectual superiority could be demonstrated and validated. His monitoring of investigative progress was obsessive and methodical. Gary read every newspaper article, watched every television report, and attended public meetings about the Green River killings. This wasn't paranoid surveillance, but psychological engagement with what he viewed as a fascinating intellectual challenge. The formation of the Green River Task Force in 1984 provided Gary with his first worthy adversaries. His psychological response to organized law enforcement attention was excitement rather than fear. He viewed the task force as recognition of his importance and skill, validation that his crimes had transcended ordinary criminal activity. Gary's psychological analysis of individual investigators was remarkably sophisticated. He studied their backgrounds, methodologies, and public statements to understand their psychological approaches to the case. This wasn't defensive intelligence gathering, but offensive psychological profiling designed to maintain his advantage. His attendance at community meetings about the murders revealed his psychological need to be close to the investigation without being detected. Gary would sit in these meetings, watching investigators speak about his crimes while internally critiquing their understanding of his methods and motivations. The psychological satisfaction Gary derived from misleading the investigation became one of his primary motivations for continued killing. Each murder that went unsolved was psychological proof of his intellectual superiority over law enforcement. The investigation had become his report card. Gary's understanding of investigative psychology was remarkably advanced for someone without formal training. He could predict how law enforcement would respond to specific crime scene configurations and body placement strategies. This knowledge allowed him to manipulate the investigation's direction through his criminal methodology. His psychological relationship with forensic evidence evolved as he learned about investigative techniques through media coverage and public statements. Gary adapted his evidence elimination procedures based on what he learned about police capabilities, treating each new forensic development as a puzzle to be solved. The interviews Gary underwent during the investigation were psychological masterpieces of deception and misdirection. He presented himself as a helpful citizen concerned about community safety while subtly steering investigators away from productive lines of inquiry. His performance was Academy Award worthy in its authenticity. Gary's psychological preparation for potential questioning was extensive and sophisticated. He developed detailed cover stories, practiced emotional responses, and prepared explanations for any suspicious circumstances investigators might discover. His mental rehearsals were more thorough than most actors' preparation. His analysis of investigative mistakes provided Gary with psychological satisfaction that rivaled the murders themselves. He could see flaws in police logic, gaps in evidence analysis, and weaknesses in investigative coordination. These failures validated his sense of intellectual superiority. The psychological pressure of being a person of interest in multiple investigations created stress that Gary managed through increased religious activity and family engagement. He used his legitimate identities as psychological anchors that kept him grounded while navigating investigative scrutiny. Gary's understanding of psychological profiling techniques allowed him to deliberately confound attempts to create accurate behavioral assessments. He could modify his crime scene signatures and victim selection patterns to create false profiles that would misdirect investigative resources. His psychological relationship with polygraph examinations revealed his confidence in his own deception capabilities. Gary passed multiple lie detector tests not through technological countermeasures, but through psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to believe his own denials while maintaining awareness of his guilt. The advancement of DNA technology created the first investigative pressure that Gary couldn't fully control or understand. His psychological response to this unknown threat was to accelerate his killing schedule while developing more sophisticated evidence elimination techniques. Gary's psychological analysis of media coverage allowed him to gauge investigative progress and public perception. He used news reports as intelligence briefings that informed his tactical decisions and helped him anticipate law enforcement moves. His relationship with individual investigators became psychologically personal over the years of investigation. Gary developed preferences for certain detectives based on their apparent competence and began to view the investigation as a multi-year intellectual duel with worthy opponents. The psychological stress of maintaining innocence while knowing his guilt created cognitive dissonance that Gary managed through elaborate rationalization systems. He convinced himself that his cooperation with investigators was actually helping them become better at their jobs. Gary's understanding of jurisdictional complications allowed him to exploit investigative fragmentation psychologically. He could commit crimes in multiple jurisdictions, knowing that bureaucratic barriers would complicate coordination and create investigative gaps he could exploit. His psychological preparation for potential arrest was remarkably thorough. Gary had developed detailed mental scenarios for various capture circumstances and had practiced emotional responses that would maintain his innocence facade even under extreme pressure. The psychological satisfaction Gary derived from outsmarting the investigation became addictive in ways that compromised his operational security. His need to demonstrate intellectual superiority began to override his survival instincts, leading him to take unnecessary risks. Gary's analysis of investigative resource allocation allowed him to identify periods when surveillance and enforcement were reduced. He could time his activities to exploit gaps in law enforcement attention created by budget constraints and personnel limitations. His psychological relationship with the victims' families was complex and disturbing. Gary could attend memorial services and community vigils while internally reliving his crimes. This proximity to grief provided psychological satisfaction that enhanced his sense of power and control. The psychological pressure of long-term investigation created fatigue effects that Gary had to manage carefully. Years of maintaining perfect deception while under scrutiny required enormous psychological energy that began to tax his mental resources. Gary's understanding of witness psychology allowed him to operate in situations where he might be observed without creating accurate identification. He could modify his appearance and behavior to ensure that any witness descriptions would be vague or misleading. His psychological adaptation to changing investigative techniques revealed his learning capacity and intellectual flexibility. Gary could analyze new police methods and develop countermeasures quickly enough to maintain his operational advantage. The psychological investment Gary made in following the investigation became so significant that it began to affect his killing methodology. He started committing crimes partially to generate investigative responses that he could study and analyze. Gary's relationship with investigative technology evolved as he learned about new forensic capabilities through media coverage. His psychological approach to technological threats was to treat them as engineering problems that could be solved through methodical analysis and adaptation. His understanding of investigative psychology allowed him to predict when pressure on the case would intensify or diminish. Gary could gauge political and media pressure that affected resource allocation and adjust his activities accordingly. The psychological complexity of Gary's relationship with the investigation reached levels that were unprecedented in serial killer psychology. He had transformed law enforcement from adversaries into unwitting partners in a psychological experiment that validated his intellectual superiority and criminal sophistication. Gary Ridgway didn't just evade the investigation, he psychologically dominated it for nearly 2 decades, treating it as a personal intellectual challenge that provided ongoing validation of his criminal genius. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The psychological unraveling of Gary Ridgway began not with a dramatic mistake or investigative breakthrough, but with the slow erosion of the very control mechanisms that had protected him for 2 decades. By 2001, advances in DNA technology had created investigative capabilities that exceeded Gary's ability to adapt, creating the first genuine threat to his operational security since he began killing. The DNA match that connected Gary to multiple victims represented more than forensic evidence. It was the psychological moment when his sense of intellectual invincibility began to crack. For the first time in his criminal career, Gary faced a technological challenge that couldn't be solved through behavioral adaptation or psychological manipulation. His arrest on November 30, 2001, triggered immediate psychological damage to his carefully constructed identity systems. The physical restraints, the reading of Miranda rights, and the loss of freedom shattered the psychological framework that had allowed him to function as both predator and family man simultaneously. Gary's initial psychological response to capture was denial so complete that it seemed pathological even by his standards. He maintained innocence with such conviction that he appeared to genuinely believe his own lies. This wasn't calculated deception, but psychological self-preservation through reality distortion. The interrogation process revealed the first cracks in Gary's psychological armor. Detective Tom Jensen's patient, methodical approach gradually dismantled the compartmentalization that had protected Gary's psyche for decades. Each piece of evidence presented was a psychological blow to his constructed identity. Gary's relationship with his legal team became psychologically complex as he struggled to maintain his innocence facade while secretly knowing that the evidence against him was overwhelming. His psychological need to appear helpful and cooperative conflicted with his survival instincts. The psychological impact of being identified as the Green River Killer was devastating to Gary's self-image. His transformation from anonymous predator to internationally recognized serial killer forced him to confront aspects of his identity that he had successfully suppressed for years. His psychological adaptation to incarceration revealed the depth of his institutionalized thinking. Gary had become so dependent on his routines and control mechanisms that the structured environment of jail actually provided psychological relief from the stress of maintaining his double life. The negotiation process that led to his plea agreement created psychological pressure unlike anything Gary had experienced. The possibility of execution forced him to weigh his psychological investment in maintaining innocence against his biological survival instincts. Gary's decision to confess represented a complete psychological breakdown of his identity systems. The admission of guilt required him to acknowledge aspects of himself that he had successfully compartmentalized for over 20 years. The psychological integration was traumatic and devastating. His initial confessions were psychologically revealing in their clinical detachment. Gary described murders with the same emotional neutrality he might use to discuss work procedures. This wasn't calculated coldness, but genuine psychological disconnection from the emotional reality of his crimes. The psychological process of accessing suppressed memories during confession sessions was remarkable to observe. Gary could recall minute details of crimes committed decades earlier, suggesting that his compartmentalization hadn't eliminated memories, but simply made them inaccessible to conscious thought. His relationship with investigators changed dramatically once he began cooperating. Gary transformed from adversary to collaborator, displaying genuine enthusiasm for helping solve cases. This psychological shift revealed his deep need for intellectual validation and professional recognition. The psychological satisfaction Gary derived from demonstrating his criminal expertise became apparent during confession sessions. He took pride in explaining his methodology, revealing crime scenes, and providing details that only the killer could know. Teaching had become his new source of validation. Gary's psychological adjustment to being viewed as a monster rather than a respected community member was remarkably rapid. He seemed to embrace his new identity as a serial killer with the same methodical efficiency he had brought to maintaining his previous facade. His ability to compartmentalize guilt and remorse, even during confession, was psychologically fascinating. Gary could acknowledge causing immense suffering while maintaining emotional detachment from the impact of his actions. The psychological barriers remained functional even in breakdown. The psychological dynamic between Gary and the families of his victims during court proceedings revealed his continued need for control and attention. He used victim impact statements as opportunities to study human emotion rather than experiencing genuine remorse. Gary's psychological relationship with media attention during his trial was complex and contradictory. He seemed to enjoy the recognition while resenting the negative characterization. The fame he had sought through his crimes had finally arrived, but not in the form he had imagined. His sentencing to life in prison without parole created psychological relief rather than despair. Gary had avoided execution while gaining the intellectual respect he had always craved. Prison became his retirement from the stress of maintaining multiple identities. The psychological adjustment Gary made to prison life revealed his remarkable adaptability. He quickly established routines and relationships that provided structure and purpose. Prison wasn't punishment, but a new environment to master and control. Gary's post-conviction interviews revealed his continued psychological investment in his criminal identity. He spoke about his crimes with professional pride, discussing methodology and efficiency with the same enthusiasm other people might show for their careers. His psychological relationship with his own mortality changed dramatically after capture. Gary no longer showed the detachment from consequences that had characterized his criminal period. The possibility of execution had forced him to confront his own vulnerability. The psychological impact of Gary's crimes on his family members became apparent during the investigation and trial. His ability to deceive those closest to him for decades had created trauma that extended far beyond his direct victims. Gary's psychological analysis of his own behavior during interviews with criminal psychologists revealed his continued need to be understood and appreciated for his sophistication. He wanted recognition as a criminal genius rather than condemnation as a monster. His adaptation to the structured interview process became another form of performance for Gary. He learned to provide investigators with exactly the information they needed while maintaining psychological control over the narrative of his crimes. The psychological breakthrough that allowed Gary to begin showing genuine emotion about his crimes came only after years of incarceration. The compartmentalization that had protected him began to dissolve under the sustained pressure of psychological analysis and medication. Gary's relationship with religious counselors in prison revealed his continued ability to adopt personas that served his psychological needs. His return to religious identity wasn't spiritual awakening, but familiar psychological territory that provided comfort and structure. His psychological legacy, as revealed through his confessions and interviews, was the portrait of a mind that had achieved unprecedented criminal efficiency through systematic suppression of normal human emotion and conscience. Gary had become a perfect killing machine by eliminating everything that made him human. The psychological breakdown that led to Gary's capture and confession wasn't the result of guilt or remorse, but the inevitable collapse of unsustainable psychological systems. After 2 decades of perfect compartmentalization, his mind could no longer maintain the energy required to suppress his true nature. Gary Ridgway's psychological journey from capture to confession revealed that even the most sophisticated criminal mind is ultimately vulnerable to technological progress and the cumulative weight of psychological pressure. His breakdown was as methodical and complete as his crimes had been. Chat controls Sonnet 4. Gary Ridgway's psychological relationship with the legal system during his prosecution and sentencing revealed the same calculating intelligence that had made him such an effective killer. His understanding of legal procedures, plea negotiations, and courtroom dynamics was remarkably sophisticated for someone with limited formal education. Gary approached the legal system as another environment to be analyzed and mastered. His initial psychological strategy in legal proceedings was to maintain his helpful, cooperative persona while protecting his core interests. Gary understood that his survival depended on appearing remorseful and useful to the prosecution, but his remorse was calculated performance rather than genuine emotion. The plea negotiation process became Gary's final chess match with the system that had pursued him for 2 decades. His psychological analysis of the prosecution's position was remarkably accurate. He understood that his cooperation was valuable enough to trade for his life, creating a strategic advantage even in custody. Gary's psychological preparation for court appearances was as methodical as his crime planning had been. He studied appropriate courtroom behavior, practiced emotional responses, and prepared statements designed to project remorse and cooperation. Every public appearance was a carefully rehearsed performance. His relationship with his defense attorneys revealed Gary's continued need for intellectual control. He participated actively in his defense strategy, offering insights and suggestions that demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and psychological manipulation of juries. The psychological impact of victim impact statements on Gary was minimal but carefully concealed. He listened to families describe their pain with apparent emotion, but his responses were calculated to appear appropriate rather than expressing genuine empathy. His compartmentalization remained functional even in this context. Gary's confession process became his opportunity to demonstrate professional expertise to legal professionals. He took pride in providing details that helped close cases, treating his cooperation as a consulting engagement rather than a moral obligation to victims' families. His psychological adaptation to the courtroom environment revealed his remarkable social intelligence. Gary could read the emotional temperature of proceedings and adjust his demeanor accordingly. He became whatever the legal system needed him to be to achieve his survival goals. The sentencing phase provided Gary with his final opportunity to control public perception of his crimes. His prepared statement was psychologically sophisticated, balancing acceptance of responsibility with subtle deflection of moral culpability. He was managing his legacy even in defeat. Gary's psychological relationship with the judge who sentenced him was respectful but calculating. He understood that Judge Richard Jones held his life in his hands and tailored his behavior to project the image of a reformed man deserving of mercy. His understanding of prison psychology helped Gary prepare for his new environment even before sentencing. He studied prison culture, inmate hierarchies, and survival strategies with the same methodical approach he had brought to killing. Prison was just another system to be mastered. The psychological pressure of facing possible execution forced Gary to confront his own mortality in ways he had avoided throughout his criminal career. This confrontation with death didn't create genuine remorse but motivated strategic cooperation that served his survival interests. Gary's psychological analysis of legal precedents in capital cases informed his cooperation strategy. He understood that providing substantial assistance to law enforcement could influence sentencing decisions and used this knowledge to maximize the value of his confessions. His relationship with court-appointed psychologists and psychiatrists became another performance venue for Gary. He learned to provide responses that satisfied their analytical needs while protecting information that might compromise his legal position or reveal the full extent of his psychological sophistication. The psychological dynamics of Gary's courtroom interactions with victims' families were complex and disturbing. He could observe their grief while feeling no genuine empathy, using their emotional responses as data points for understanding normal human psychology rather than motivation for remorse. Gary's adaptation to legal time schedules and procedures revealed his continued ability to function effectively within structured systems. The legal process provided the kind of routine and predictability that his psychology required for optimal performance. His psychological understanding of media coverage during legal proceedings allowed him to influence public perception through careful management of his courtroom persona. Gary knew that every gesture and expression would be analyzed and used his knowledge to shape his public image. The psychological satisfaction Gary derived from being the center of such extensive legal proceedings was considerable. After years of operating in secrecy, he was finally receiving the attention and recognition he had always craved, even if the context was criminal prosecution. Gary's cooperation with prosecutors created a psychological dynamic where he became a partner in the legal process rather than simply a defendant. This collaborative relationship satisfied his need for intellectual respect while serving his strategic interests. His psychological preparation for life imprisonment was remarkably thorough. Gary had studied prison systems, understood the challenges he would face, and developed strategies for thriving in a correctional environment. He approached prison as a new career requiring specific skills. The psychological impact of Gary's guilty plea on his identity systems was carefully managed. He could admit guilt for legal purposes while maintaining psychological distance from moral responsibility. His compartmentalization allowed him to plead guilty without experiencing genuine guilt. Gary's understanding of appellate procedures and post-conviction legal options revealed his continued engagement with the legal system as an intellectual challenge. Even after sentencing, he viewed legal proceedings as opportunities to demonstrate his intelligence and expertise. His psychological relationship with correctional officers and prison administrators became another environment for applying his social manipulation skills. Gary understood that his comfort and safety in prison depended on his ability to manage relationships with authority figures. The psychological dynamics of Gary's interactions with other inmates were carefully calculated. He used his notoriety as the Green River Killer to establish respect while avoiding conflicts that might jeopardize his safety. His criminal reputation became a form of currency in prison culture. Gary's psychological adaptation to the loss of freedom was remarkably successful. He found ways to exercise control within the constraints of prison life, establishing routines and relationships that provided structure and purpose. Prison became a manageable environment rather than punishment. His continued cooperation with cold case investigations after sentencing revealed Gary's ongoing need for intellectual engagement and professional validation. Helping solve unsolved murders provided him with purpose and recognition that satisfied his psychological requirements. The psychological evolution of Gary's relationship with his crimes continued even after legal proceedings concluded. He began to view his criminal career with a mixture of professional pride and strategic regret, analyzing his methods while expressing appropriate remorse for legal and social purposes. Gary's psychological legacy within the legal system extended beyond his individual case. His cooperation provided templates for future plea negotiations with serial killers, demonstrating how the justice system could extract value from criminal expertise while achieving legal objectives. His psychological understanding of victim advocacy and legal reform allowed Gary to position himself as a resource for improving investigative techniques and prevention strategies. He transformed from perpetrator to consultant, finding new sources of validation within the system that had captured him. The psychological sophistication Gary demonstrated throughout legal proceedings revealed that his intelligence and manipulative abilities remained intact despite his capture and conviction. The legal system had stopped his killing but hadn't fundamentally changed his psychology. Gary Ridgway's navigation of the legal system demonstrated that even in defeat, his psychological approach remained calculating, strategic, and focused on maximizing his advantages within whatever constraints he faced. The legal system had captured his body, but never truly conquered his mind. Chat Controls Sonnet 4. The psychological legacy of Gary Ridgway extends far beyond his individual crimes, fundamentally changing how law enforcement, mental health professionals, and society understand the intersection of intelligence, compartmentalization, and predatory behavior. His case represents a watershed moment in criminal psychology that continues to influence investigative techniques and prevention strategies decades after his capture. Gary's demonstration that highly organized serial killers could maintain completely normal social facades for decades shattered traditional assumptions about criminal behavior patterns. His case proved that the most dangerous predators might be the ones who appear most normal, forcing a complete reevaluation of risk assessment and detection methodologies. The psychological sophistication Gary displayed in maintaining multiple identities simultaneously has become a template for understanding how compartmentalization can enable long-term criminal behavior. His ability to be genuinely loving toward family while methodically killing strangers revealed the terrifying potential of human psychological flexibility. His case fundamentally changed how investigators approach background checks and character references in serial killer investigations. Gary's impeccable reputation in his community, his religious involvement, and his stable employment history had actually protected him from suspicion, teaching law enforcement that traditional markers of respectability could be deliberately cultivated camouflage. The psychological insights gained from Gary's extensive confessions have contributed to the development of more sophisticated offender profiling techniques. His detailed explanations of victim selection criteria, methodology, development, and operational security have provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a highly organized predator. Gary's ability to pass multiple polygraph examinations while guilty of dozens of murders led to significant changes in how law enforcement views and utilizes lie detection technology. His case demonstrated that sophisticated psychological compartmentalization could defeat traditional interrogation techniques and technological deception detection. The environmental factors that enabled Gary's crimes for over 2 decades have influenced urban planning and social service approaches to protecting vulnerable populations. His systematic exploitation of social invisibility has led to enhanced support systems for sex workers, homeless individuals, and people struggling with addiction. His case has become a foundational study in criminal psychology programs worldwide, teaching future law enforcement professionals and mental health practitioners about the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that enable long-term predatory behavior while maintaining social integration. The investigative techniques developed specifically to capture Gary, particularly the advancement of DNA technology and database management, have revolutionized how cold cases are approached and solved. His capture marked a turning point in the application of forensic science to historical criminal investigations. Gary's psychological relationship with his crimes has provided crucial insights into the development of criminal addiction and escalation patterns. His clinical descriptions of how killing became psychologically necessary rather than emotionally driven have informed understanding of compulsive criminal behavior. The psychological impact Gary's crimes had on his community has become a case study in collective trauma and recovery. The Pacific Northwest's experience with long-term predatory threat has influenced how communities prepare for and respond to serial criminal activity. His ability to manipulate religious communities while actively committing murders has led to enhanced awareness within faith-based organizations about the potential for predators to exploit religious environments for camouflage and victim access. The psychological techniques Gary used to avoid detection have informed cybersecurity and counterintelligence training programs. His operational security methods and social engineering capabilities have applications beyond criminal investigation into national security and corporate protection. Gary's case has fundamentally changed how mental health professionals assess and treat individuals with antisocial personality disorders. His demonstration that high-functioning psychopaths could maintain treatment compliance while actively engaging in criminal behavior has enhanced diagnostic and monitoring protocols. The family dynamics that enabled Gary's psychological development have become foundational material for understanding how childhood trauma and dysfunctional relationships can contribute to the development of predatory psychology. His case has influenced child protection and intervention strategies. His sophisticated victim selection psychology has contributed to the development of enhanced protection programs for vulnerable populations. Understanding how predators identify and exploit vulnerability has led to more effective safety education and risk reduction strategies. The psychological mechanisms Gary used to suppress guilt and maintain his self-image have provided insights into how conscience and empathy can be systematically disabled. His case has influenced research into moral development and ethical decision-making processes. Gary's ability to maintain intimate relationships while actively killing has become a crucial case study in understanding how predators compartmentalize emotions and manipulate those closest to them. His psychology has informed domestic violence prevention and detection programs. The investigative frustrations created by Gary's sophisticated methodology have led to enhanced interagency coordination protocols and information sharing systems. His ability to exploit jurisdictional gaps has influenced how multi-agency investigations are structured and managed. His case has become central to discussions about capital punishment and plea negotiations in serial killer cases. The trade-off between execution and cooperation that characterized Gary's legal resolution has influenced prosecution strategies and victim advocacy approaches. The psychological pressure points that eventually led to Gary's capture have informed interrogation training and suspect management techniques. Understanding how his psychological systems eventually broke down has enhanced law enforcement's ability to apply strategic pressure in similar cases. Gary's continued cooperation with law enforcement after conviction has provided ongoing insights into criminal psychology and cold case investigation techniques. His willingness to assist with unsolved cases has created a unique resource for understanding historical criminal patterns. The technological advances that made Gary's capture possible have continued to evolve based on lessons learned from his case. DNA technology, database management, and forensic analysis have all been enhanced through application to Green River investigation techniques. His psychological adaptation to prison life has provided insights into how long-term offenders adjust to incarceration and maintain psychological stability in correctional environments. His case has influenced prison management and rehabilitation program development. The media attention surrounding Gary's case has influenced how serial killer investigations are covered and how public information is managed to avoid compromising ongoing investigations while maintaining community awareness and safety. Gary's case has become a benchmark for measuring the effectiveness of serial killer investigations and has influenced the allocation of resources for cold case investigations. His capture demonstrated that persistent investigation and technological advancement could solve even the most sophisticated criminal cases. The psychological legacy of Gary Ridgway continues to evolve as new technologies and investigative techniques are developed. His case remains a touchstone for understanding how intelligence, psychological sophistication, and social camouflage can enable predatory behavior on an unprecedented scale. The prevention strategies developed in response to Gary's methods focus on early identification of psychological warning signs, enhanced protection for vulnerable populations, and improved community awareness of predatory psychology. His legacy has contributed to making society safer through enhanced understanding of how sophisticated predators operate. Gary Ridgway's psychological impact on criminal justice, mental health treatment, and community safety will continue to influence prevention and investigation strategies for generations. His case represents both the terrifying potential of human psychological sophistication and the ultimate triumph of persistence, technology, and dedicated investigation over criminal intelligence. The most important lesson from Gary's psychological legacy is that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who appear most normal, requiring constant vigilance, sophisticated detection methods, and comprehensive support systems for vulnerable populations to prevent future tragedies of similar scope and sophistication. Chat controls Sonnet 4.